It was a cold, foggy night. The air was thick, and the streets were quiet. Bus 375 waited at the station, its engine humming softly in the darkness. The night was eerie. Few people walked the streets, and the fog made it hard to see anything clearly. The old man was the first to board the bus. He walked slowly, his cane tapping the ground. As he moved, his face was tired, and his eyes seemed lost in thought. He sat at the front, near the driver. Then came the young couple. They were holding hands, whispering to each other. As they stepped onto the bus, they sat together in the middle, laughing softly, unaware of the strange feeling in the air. Finally, a man wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat entered the bus. He didn't speak. He didn't look at anyone. He walked straight to the back and sat down, keeping his head low. The bus driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced at his passengers through the rearview mirror. He started the engine and drove off into the night. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the bus. As it rolled down the highway, the road was empty, stretching out endlessly into the darkness. As the bus drove further away from the city, something strange began to happen. The passengers felt it first. A sudden drop in temperature, the windows frosted over, and the bus seemed to move slower, like it was being pulled into the fog. The old man looked out the window, but saw nothing. The couple stopped whispering and held each other tightly. The man in the back didn't move at all. He just sat there, staring ahead. And then, in the blink of an eye, the bus vanished, gone, disappeared into the fog, leaving no trace behind. Days passed, and the city was in shock. Bus 375 never reached its destination. No one knew what had happened. The families of the missing passengers searched for answers, desperate to find out where their loved ones had gone. Mary, the old man's granddaughter, couldn't sleep. Every night, she dreamed of her grandfather, sitting on the bus, looking out the window. He had always been so strong, but now he was gone without a trace. She visited the bus station every day, hoping to find someone who had seen something, anything, that could explain the mystery. Meanwhile, Jack, a local journalist, became obsessed with the story. He had covered strange events before, but nothing like this. He spoke to the families, interviewed witnesses, and even went to the police, but no one had answers. It was like the bus had just disappeared into thin air. Jack's curiosity grew. He started digging deeper, reading old reports of strange disappearances. Along the same highway, he found stories about other vehicles that had gone missing in the fog, never to be seen again. One day, he met a woman named Sarah. Her husband had been on the bus with her that night, but she had gotten off just before it disappeared. Sarah was the only survivor, and she had a strange story to tell. "I felt it," she said, her voice trembling. "I felt the bus slow down. The air grew colder. Something wasn't right. I told my husband we should get off at the next stop, but he laughed it off. I was scared, though. So I left. I got off the bus, and when I turned around, it was gone." Jack listened carefully. This was the first real clue he had, but it only deepened the mystery. What had happened to the bus, and why had it vanished so suddenly? Jack lived alone in a small house, near the highway, where the distant hum of passing cars was a constant companion. But the night bus 375 disappeared, everything changed. The highway fell into an eerie silence. Even the usual sounds of late night travelers vanished. 4 days, Jack went about his routine, convincing himself that what he had heard, those strange, distant noises, was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, people in town were talking about it everywhere, in the cafe, in the grocery store, and even at the bar. Bus 375 was all anyone could talk about. He couldn't escape the hushed voices, and nervous laughter of people who were clearly spooked, but trying to act normal. On the 5th night after the bus vanished, Jack sat on his porch, gazing into the thick fog that had settled over the highway. There was something about the fog. It seemed unnatural, heavier, and more suffocating than usual. He sipped his beer, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. Then, without warning, he heard it. A low, guttural rumbling sound, so faint it could have been the wind. But the wind wasn't blowing. Jack put down his beer, his eyes narrowing. The sound grew louder. Slowly, it morphed into something more distinct. Wheels turning on asphalt, metal clinking, like chains dragging behind a vehicle. Jack stood, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He scanned the road. There, just beyond the bend, two faint lights appeared in the fog. At first, they were dim, like the distant flicker of lanterns. But as the seconds ticked by, the lights grew stronger, brighter, and they were moving toward him. Jack's breath hitched. His logical mind screamed at him to go inside, but his feet stayed planted firmly in place. He couldn't move, couldn't look away from those lights. As they drew nearer, he realized what they were. Headlights. His blood turned cold. It was a bus, but no ordinary bus. This one seemed to glide over the road, its engine eerily silent. As it approached, the fog swirled around it like a living entity, obscuring most of the vehicle from view. The only thing Jack could see clearly was the front windshield, dark and empty, with no sign of a driver. Panic surged through him. Without thinking, he stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut behind him. His pulse raced as he peered through the window. The lights were still there, hovering just outside the house, as if waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the bus vanished into the fog, leaving behind only silence. Jack didn't sleep that night. Word of Jack's encounter spread quickly. The townspeople, already on edge, began to panic. Sightings of strange lights and phantom buses flooded in. A mechanic named Tim claimed he had seen the bus while driving home late at night. He said it had pulled up alongside his truck, gliding silently beside him for a full mile, before vanishing without a trace. "What did you see?" Jack asked when he cornered Tim in the bar. A few nights later, Tim's eyes were wide with fear. "It was real, man. I swear to God. It was right there. I could see inside. But there was nothing. No driver, no passengers, just nothing." Others started sharing their own stories. A woman walking her dog late at night claimed she heard the unmistakable sound of a bus door opening behind her, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. Another man swore he saw the bus parked at a rest stop, its headlights flickering, but when he approached, it dissolved into the fog. The more people talked, the more the fear spread. No one wanted to be outside at night anymore. Parents stopped letting their children play near the highway. The gas station, usually open 24 hours, started closing early. The fog didn't help either. It seemed to grow thicker by the day, smothering the town like a heavy blanket. Ms. Gray, the town librarian, noticed the change immediately. Normally, the library was a place of calm, a sanctuary where people came to read and escape. But lately, even the library felt oppressive. Fewer people visited, and those who did spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the windows. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Ms. Gray stumbled upon the story. She had always been a curious person. In fact, that is why she became a librarian. So, when she heard about bus 375, she couldn't resist the urge to dig into the town's history. She spent hours sifting through old newspapers and town records, determined to find any mention of strange occurrences on the highway. Her breakthrough came late one night, when she discovered an old journal tucked away in the archives. The journal belonged to a man named Daniel Harper, who had lived in the town nearly a century ago. His entries were dated from the early 1900s and described a series of unusual events that took place along the same stretch of road where bus 375 disappeared. One entry, in particular, caught our attention. June 14, 1903. I have seen it again. The coach. It rides through the fog, carrying no living souls. The driver, if you can call it that, is a shadow of a man, his eyes burning like hot coals. Those who board the coach never return. Miss Gray's heart raced as she read further. The entries detailed numerous sightings of a haunted coach that appeared on foggy nights, taking passengers who were never seen again. Harper described it as a phantom coach, cursed to travel the highway for eternity. The similarities to bus 375 were too striking to ignore. Miss Gray felt a chill run down her spine. Could it be that the bus was cursed? Was it possible that history was repeating itself? Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the bus was somehow connected to the town's past. After hearing about Miss Gray's discovery, he knew they had to investigate further. He visited the library, where Miss Gray showed him the journal, and explained her theory about the phantom coach. "I think it is the same curse," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The coach from the 1900s and bus 375, they are both connected to the road. It is like the highway is feeding on something." Jack wasn't sure if he believed in curses, but he couldn't deny that something strange was happening. The bus wasn't just haunting the road, it was hunting. That night, Jack and Miss Gray decided to take matters into their own hands. They would return to the highway, but this time they would be prepared. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a tape recorder, they set out for the bend in the road where Jack had seen the bus. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around them as they walked. The air was cold, biting at their skin. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. As they approached the spot, he could feel the tension in the air, as if the fog itself was watching them. Suddenly, the familiar sound of wheels creaking on asphalt echoed through the mist. Jack froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The rumbling grew louder, and then, out of the fog, the bus appeared. It was exactly as Jack remembered it. The headlights glowed dimly, the windows were dark, and the door creaked open slowly, inviting them inside. "Do you see it?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Miss Gray nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It is real," she breathed. "It is really here." The bus idled in front of them. Waiting, Jack's instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. He had to know what was inside. "I am going in," he said, taking a step forward. "No," Miss Gray grabbed his arm. "We don't know what will happen." Jack hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity, but something inside him, something deeper, stronger, pushed him forward. He couldn't live in fear forever. If he didn't confront the bus now, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the bus. As Jack's foot crossed the threshold of the bus, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath came out in white clouds, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Inside, the bus was eerily silent. The seats were empty, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had sat in them for years. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw movement. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But when he looked closer, he realized the shadows weren't just shadows. They were people, ghostly figures, barely visible, sitting in the seats, staring straight ahead. Jack's heart raced as he took another step forward. The figures didn't move, didn't react to his presence. It was as if they didn't even see him. He scanned their faces, trying to make out any features, but they were blurry, like looking through a fogged up window. He swallowed hard and reached for the tape recorder in his pocket. If he could just capture something, anything, it might prove he wasn't crazy. He pressed the record button and whispered, "I'm on the bus. There are passengers, but they are not. They are not human." Suddenly, one of the figures turned its head toward him. Jack froze. The figure's face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes were glowing red. The glowing red eyes of the figure bore into Jack, paralyzing him where he stood. It was as though those eyes could see straight through him, peeling away his skin, revealing his very soul. Jack's heart raced, pounding so loudly in his ears that he thought it might explode. He tried to step back, to retreat to the safety of the foggy night outside, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure, no, the shadow, rose from its seat, its outline flickering like a candle's flame in the wind. As it approached, the bus grew colder still, the frost creeping along the windows and spreading like icy fingers up Jack's spine. His breath caught in his throat as the ghostly figure came to a stop mere inches from him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Jack, too terrified to speak, and the figure, now clearly visible, seemed to be waiting. But for what? Behind him, Miss Gray's voice broke through the icy silence. "Jack, get out of there, now." Her words snapped him out of his trance, and he stumbled backward, his hands still clutching the tape recorder, as if it could somehow protect him. The shadow figure's eyes followed him, glowing brighter with each step. He took toward the door, just as Jack's foot hit the ground outside the bus. The figure's hand shot out, grasping the air where he had stood moments before. Jack nearly tripped over his own feet as he dashed off the bus, slamming into Miss Gray in his desperation to get away. She caught him, and together they ran into the fog, not stopping until they were far from the highway. They collapsed in a heap near a grove of trees, both gasping for breath, the chill of the bus still clinging to their skin. "Did you see it?" Jack panted, looking at Miss Gray with wide eyes. She nodded, her face pale. "I saw something, but what was it? What does it want?" Jack pulled out the tape recorder, his hands trembling as he rewound the tape. He pressed play, and they both listened. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, they heard Jack's voice. "I am on the bus. There are passengers. But they are not human." But that wasn't all. There was another voice on the tape, low and raspy, barely audible over the static. It whispered two words, "Join us." Miss Gray's face turned even paler. It is calling you, Jack." Jack's blood ran cold. He had heard those words before. Years ago, when he was a child, his grandfather had told him stories of the haunted coach that roamed the countryside, a spectral vehicle that lured the unsuspecting into its cold embrace. His grandfather had warned him never to walk near the highway on foggy nights. Now, Jack realized with a sickening certainty that his grandfather's stories weren't just fairy tales. They were real. The next day, Jack and Miss Gray sat in the library, poring over every bit of information they could find about the cursed coach and its connection to bus 375. The more they uncovered, the more horrifying the truth became. According to town legends, the original coach had once been a transport for prisoners, condemned souls, who were being sent to their final judgment. But something went wrong. One foggy night, the coach vanished into thin air, only to reappear decades later, haunting the roads and preying on the living. Miss Gray found an old map of the town, and as they traced the route of the cursed coach, they realized it followed the same path as the modern highway right past where Jack's house stood. "It is like the road itself is cursed," Miss Gray muttered, running her fingers over the lines on the map. The coach and the bus, they are bound to it. Jack frowned. But why now? The bus just disappeared. Why is it back? And why is it haunting us? Miss Gray hesitated. I think the bus is trying to complete the journey. It never finished. It is looking for more passengers. People to take with it to the other side. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. You mean, it is collecting souls? Miss Gray nodded grimly. Yes, and if we don't stop it, more people will disappear. Jack's mind raced as he considered their options. They couldn't just sit back and wait for the bus to take more victims. But what could they do? It wasn't like they could call the police and tell them about a ghost bus. No, they had to take matters into their own hands. They needed to confront the curse head-on. Miss Gray suggested visiting the oldest living resident of the town, Mr. Harrington, who had grown up hearing stories about the haunted coach from his own grandfather. Maybe he could provide some answers. The next day, they made their way to the small, crumbling house at the edge of town, where Mr. Harrington lived. He was nearly 90, his body frail, but his mind was still sharp. When Jack and Miss Gray told him about the bus, his eyes darkened with understanding. So, it has come back, Mr. Harrington said in a raspy voice. I knew it would, sooner or later. Jack leaned forward. What do you mean? Mr. Harrington sighed, his bony fingers tracing the edge of his worn armchair. The curse was never lifted. My grandfather told me stories about that coach. It took people, good people, and they were never seen again. But the curse isn't just on the road. It is on the land itself. That bus is trapped between this world and the next, and it needs more souls to break free. Miss Gray's eyes widened. How do we stop it? There is only one way, Mr. Harrington replied, his voice barely a whisper. You have to destroy the bus before it collects any more souls. But be warned, it won't go down without a fight. Jack's heart sank. Destroy the bus. How were they supposed to do that? It was a ghost bus, for God's sake. But what choice did they have? That night, Jack and Miss Gray returned to the highway, armed with gasoline, matches, and a determination to end the curse. Once and for all, the fog was thicker than ever, swallowing the road in its icy grip. They stood at the bend, where the bus had appeared before, waiting. Minutes passed, then hours, just when they began to lose hope. The familiar rumbling echoed through the mist. The bus emerged from the fog, its headlights glowing faintly in the darkness. Jack's pulse quickened. This was it. There was no turning back now. As the bus came to a stop, in front of them, Jack stepped forward, clutching the canister of gasoline. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to do this. Suddenly, the bus door creaked open, and the same shadowy figure from before appeared in the doorway. Its red eyes locked onto Jack, sending a jolt of fear through his body. But this time, he didn't run. Instead, he doused the bus in gasoline, the liquid splashing over the windows and pooling on the ground beneath it. The figure inside the bus didn't move, didn't try to stop him. It simply watched. With shaking hands, Jack pulled out a match, struck it, and threw it onto the gasoline. The flames erupted instantly, engulfing the bus in a fiery blaze. The heat was intense, forcing Jack and Miss Gray to step back for a moment. It seemed like the fire would consume the entire vehicle. But then, something strange happened. The bus began to flicker, like an old television losing its signal. The flames sputtered, and the bus wavered in and out of existence. Suddenly, a deafening roar echoed from within the bus. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its form twisting and contorting, as it tried to escape the flames. But it was too late. With one final, agonized scream, the bus and its ghostly passengers vanished into the night, leaving only a smoldering patch of asphalt in their wake. The fog lifted that night, and the town was finally free. from the curse that had haunted it. For so long, people slowly returned to their normal lives, though the memory of bus 375 lingered in their minds like a bad dream. Jack and Ms. Gray never spoke of that night again. They didn't need to. The silence between them was enough to understand that some things were better left forgotten. But every now and then, when the fog rolled in and the wind howled through the trees, Jack couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Or was the bus still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next passengers? If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.